Good night, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to start by congratulating Rai for taking the effort to produce this excellent book. He mentioned Stephen Stomfield, who has a chapter in the book. Stephen has done an important book as well, and I think that this particular book adds to the body of work which we need to be doing in Port of Spain and about Port of Spain. The book is correctly entitled Architectural Record, and it does a very good job of recording most of the buildings of a whole spectrum: dilapidated, in great condition, renovated, new, modern, old. And I think it really is a contemporary record of 2021 of the architecture in Port of Spain. But today, the collection of articles, however, takes the book in a slightly different direction, because it starts to bring views of academics, historians, stakeholders in the process. And I think it's useful that we use the book as a takeoff point for us to have some discussions on, as Brian asked us to do, to talk about thinking about the capital city. Well, I am normally accused of being political in my planning and my utterances, but because Stephen took that position, I could take a little more technical and be a little thinking about some of the things that the book has made me think about. Right? So I would want to reflect on three things that the book stimulated me to think about. One is I want to talk a bit about boundaries. The second one, I want to talk a bit about districts. And the third thing, I want to talk a bit about margins. Now, I'm not following Kevin Lynch's model, right? It may sound similar. So let me talk a bit about boundaries first. The book focuses on the formal city of Port of Spain. In fact, most of the formal city. The administrative city of Port of Spain. That is the various districts that you chose, are the administrative districts of Port of Spain. However, that is the administrative city of Port of Spain. Functional Port of Spain is very different from that. Steve and I managed the last formal planning exercise for Port of Spain, and that is the 2009-2010 Port of Spain plan, which I don't know where it is, Gregory, in terms of being implemented. But in that particular exercise, we convinced the authorities to allow us to do a metropolitan planning framework, and that is to include the city of Port of Spain with the eastern area of Salmon Laventille and with Diego Martin. Because if you really think about what Port of Spain is, those are functionally part of the city. East Port of Spain has historically been completely functionally part of Port of Spain. And Diego Martin has become a functional suburb of Port of Spain. So it's hard for you to take part of Port of Spain alone, which is the administrative area, very little of the residences, some of the businesses, and try and understand Port of Spain. So if we have to do better planning, Stephen, for Port of Spain, I think we need to understand what has been happening in Port of Spain, right? So in terms of boundaries, it's very clear that Port of Spain is in really a large metropolitan area, not with 50,000 or 40,000 people, but with about 300,000 people. And if you don't understand that, you can't understand the traffic, you can't understand the location of businesses, you can't understand where people recreate, you can't understand any of those things. So that we need to understand the shifting and changing boundaries of Port of Spain to better understand how it functions, and therefore, if we understand that, what we could do about it. The other thing about Port of Spain is it is moving from east to west as a general trajectory. Port of Spain was located very strongly in East Port of Spain, and what we call Laventille and East Port was functionally part of the Port of Spain in a very meaningful way. And in fact, it didn't go too far west. In fact, until the 19th century, late 19th century, there were large sugar estates on the west of Port of Spain. Sinclair Estate, Woodbrook Estate, Coblin's Estate, all those were sugar estates. So Port of Spain is shifting westwards, and what you have is you have decay in the east and movement of businesses out. So Gregory, I'm sure you would understand that your business will be served by captive transit users in Port of Spain with people who are there. People no longer leave the suburbs to come into downtown to shop. I mean, that is the reality of it. People who have to be there or who are captive transit users who have option, they will be shopping in your business. So what has happened is this movement west is the decay of parts of Port of Spain, predominantly more decay in the east and more movement of businesses. And this affects the nature of the architecture. It affects the nature of the buildings, what type of business, it affects the land use mix. All these things are affected by the shift to the west. So one thing I just wanted to point out, I saw a picture recently. Stephen, you talked about tram cars. I saw a picture in Domino's in Diego Martin, and the picture said, tram car in 4 roads. I never knew the tram car reached as far as 4 roads. Right? If the tram car reached as far as 4 roads, then this process of suburbanization and growth has been going on for a very long time. If public transport, the same tram cars we're talking about, reached here, because the picture has a tram car, a donkey cart, and a carriage in the same picture. So it gives you an idea of how old that is. Right. So the next thing I want to talk about is districts. So Brian, you have very useful districts, but those are in many ways the districts are defined by the City of Port of Spain and the CSO. Right. Those are the districts. But within those districts, there are districts. And each of them have their own unique architecture and design and so on. So the little area between Colville Street and French Street is a district within Woodbrook. It's neither Woodbrook nor Port of Spain. It has its own unique style. So is Newtown. Right? Newtown was originally larger parcels when the first subdivision of Sinclair Estate was done, but it was divided into smaller parcels. That's why they're thin and long. They just simply cut the parcels that way. And the size of the lots had a whole completely different impact on land use, socioeconomic class, right, and built development. And they created very interesting niches for people who wanted to get into business. I had a business in Picton Street because I could afford to rent a small place. It was a pre-press, a graphic business. I could afford to rent a small off-front in Kensington Court where I couldn't afford that place anywhere else, but I was still right in the heart of the city. So many small businesses were able to get into the Newtown area and to get small places to rent or sometimes to live. What we've seen happening is the planning authorities are allowing amalgamation of those parcels of land. So that fabric is disappearing, right? You see government ministers accumulating land in Newtown area, right? And building buildings. So you see large developments taking place, and the city is losing that little niche area. Uptown Port of Spain, where Stephen said people lived and worked, is virtually gone. Sorry? Uptown Port of Spain, where people lived and worked before, because it's largely residential, that's largely gone. So I'm just making this point to say that when we take large neighborhoods, we have to think about sub-districts within it and the dynamics of those small districts, because their land use and all are affected fundamentally by the lot sizes, and it affects all sorts of other things. And as those change, those range of urban opportunities disappear as well. So let me talk slightly now about margins. I'll talk about what margins are. Margin is the boundary area, the margin of the city where if you're smart, you don't cross. And it is where when I travel, I try to get to the margin in cities around the world. So when I was in Williamstad, I got caught a few years ago trying to get to Haiti. I went and I spent my time in the Otra Banda in Williamstad. Completely different, historically informally developed, lots of interesting types of space. Now it is full of people who want interesting restaurants and office spaces and so on, because the informality allowed a different type of space. I go to Tiger Bay in Guyana. In Lisbon, the Las Palmas district, which is up on the hill. If you look at it closely, it's like East Port of Spain, right? looks like East Port of Spain. And when you walk into it, you get that feeling. But what you get there, you get restaurants, you get craft, you get music, and you get people, normal people living in it, working down in the center of Lisbon. These are just illustrations that sometimes interesting parts of the life of the city are in areas that are marginalized. And many people live and grow up in a city and never experience or understand that the city is a complex thing with all sorts of things happening in it. So Gary, you have written some sections on the East Port of Spain. And I have spent a lot of time trying to understand East Port of Spain and its relationship to Port of Spain, because in a way, East Port of Spain is where all the people who couldn't earn good wages and buy decent housing went into it. And East Port of Spain is actually not made up of squatters, as people think. They're made up of land. They're renters. A lot of the old brown-skinned families, like McShine family and so on, rented large parcels of land, and they cut it up. Wasn't properly subdivided. It was haphazardly developed, and those problems are with us today. But in East Port of Spain, there are very interesting areas, very interesting streetscapes. There are two fabulous streets right next to St. Martin de Porres, where there are early 19th century public housing. 2 rows, one duplexes and the other, and they slowly, up until 2 years ago, I took students there. I went there 2 weeks ago, and the change is taking place. We're going to lose that, as we've lost a lot of the barrack houses where East Bridge was going to be built. Those were demolished. A lot of old barrack housing, early housing. And we have gradually losing all the old barrack yards. Stephen, your dad wrote about the literature. He was one of the main authors of literature of the yard. And they were writing about the life in that East Port of Spain area. People living in the urban areas in barrack yards and all those types of things. We have lost, in my mind, not just the understanding of the culture of that important part of Port of Spain, but we're actually losing the buildings and the barrack yards, and we're not recording it. So Brian, next time you get around to write an epilogue to this book, make sure you record some of those things. I don't want to talk too much about this here, but what I would say is that Piccadilly Street is a margin. Some people I know are afraid to drive down Piccadilly Street, but they never venture behind it. I worked with Margaret McDowell and Rudlin Roberts on trying to categorize built and cultural heritage in East Port of Spain, and we categorized buildings. We looked at approaches to try and work on that, and how to use that to stimulate economic activity in that area. And there are many tremendously fabulous, still very derelict now, houses in East Port of Spain. Having looked through the book, I made the effort to stop on St. Francois Valley Road last weekend and walk up a road called Hedgerow Road to look at a house I always pass by, St. Francois Valley Road. And halfway up the hill, I walked up and I saw a house that had one of those rotundas on one side, old wooden structure, nice gable houses, and it had a vista, Brian, of the whole dock area. And I called the lady out who said she moved in 1960, right? Her dad came from Cedros. And she said in those days you could see the whole dock all the way along the coast. And I could see it, I could see the buildings popping up. So there were houses halfway up the hill, going up to Lady Young, in the early 19th century, that had already made use of that. So that part of Port of Spain, we need to classify and correct. And I just want to say that one of the things, Brian, is that architects tend to look at buildings, planners tend to look more at streetscapes. And when you do the next work, and I see you recorded some of the visual around the squares, but there's some beautiful streetscapes in East Port of Spain. You had a little excerpt from that, from the design where they tried to fix a street, right? But there are many where just the fabric of walking around and the feel of the buildings and so on is part of the heritage, the built heritage and the architectural heritage in Port of Spain, and we need to think about that. So I just wanted to raise a few of these points on trying to understand what is happening in the city. and how it has influenced the architecture and form and where I think it is going. Thank you.